All right, so we're all in this class because we know that X-rays are harmful, right? And so we need to equip you with the appropriate tools and how do you protect yourself from radiation exposure. We know that X-rays are harmful, and especially if the X-rays are very intense, it can cause skin burns, cataracts, cancer, leukemia, and some other types of harmful effects. But we also know that the benefits outweigh the risks. It's the only way we can make a proper diagnosis and we can give proper treatment to the patients who's ever in the hospital, right? The objective here, if you look on the next page here, is ALARA. Okay, are we all familiar with what ALARA is? Okay, as low as reasonably achievable. Our objective is to provide the highest quality radiographic image while minimizing patient exposure. But it goes hand in hand, okay? Because if we are minimizing patient exposure, what's happening to our exposure?
It's minimized.
We're also minimizing it, okay? So in the long run, that's what we're trying to do. We're protecting ourselves by protecting our patients. Now, the biological human response occurs at the atomic level, usually occurs with the outer shell electrons. Ionization is one of the properties of X-rays. It causes things to ionize. Okay? All ionization is when the radiation strikes an outer shell electron, it knocks it out and the atom becomes unstable. And it continues to release excess energy until a free electron fills in the orbital electron spot and then becomes neutral again. That is known as the direct effect. So the direct effect is when the radiation strikes an outer shell electron and knocks it out of its outer shell. Okay? The other human response is what's known as the indirect effect. And this usually happens with water molecules because our body is mostly composed of water. This effect is more dominant than the direct effect. So when this happens, when the indirect effect occurs, it strikes a water molecule and it splits it up into different molecules. These molecules can either join up to form another stable water molecule, or this is what we don't want happening. If it splits up and then it splits up again, okay, what happens is there is what's called free radicals. Free radicals are unstable particles. Okay? So these free radicals, a hydrogen free radical and an oxygen free radical, is released and it contains excess energy. Excess energy. And it's that excess energy that is deposited on human tissue. This is the indirect effect. Okay? This is the indirect effect. So when you have particles that are unstable, they deposit energy in your atoms, which can cause the molecule itself to become altered. What can happen is the function of that particular molecule can change, it can be altered. It could stop functioning and can also cause cell death. Now, if you read the chapter, is this reversible? Is cell repair reversible?
Yeah.
The answer is yes. It is reversible. So the ionized atoms, as we said earlier, they can, join up with other electrons, free electrons, to return them back to a stable state. Or the molecules themselves can be mended. They can be mended by repair enzymes. They can be mended by repair enzymes. questions so far? Now, how the body responds can be broken up into two different categories. If radiation response increases with severity, with increasing dose, okay, so if radiation response increases with severity with increasing dose, in other words, if there is more damage caused by more radiation, this is known as a deterministic effect. They go hand in hand. They are directly proportional. So with increase of radiation, the effect or the damage also increases. This is deterministic effect. The effects of extreme dose occurs within days. This includes tissue damage, organ dysfunction, or even death. The other category here is stochastic. If the frequency or the incidence increases as a response to an increase of radiation, this is a little bit different now. The other one, we're talking about immediate damage. Here, we're talking about the increased chances or the likelihood of damage. If that increases with the increase of radiation exposure, this is known as stochastic effect. Stochastic effect. And stochastic effects don't happen immediately. You don't see them until months, maybe years down the line. Now, as technologists, which of these two are we more concerned with? Stochastic effects. Because we're dealing with low doses of radiation, we don't know whether or not we have damage until months, maybe years down the line. They won't appear until months or years down the line. Okay? Because again, they're not immediate. So that's what we're concerned with, is low dose exposure to radiation. Okay. Any questions so far? Now here are some examples of deterministic effects. Remember, the damage increases with increased dosage. Now what we're talking about here is extreme doses. This has been exemplified when we've had nuclear accidents, and not so much of an accident like the bombing of Hiroshima, okay, the Chernobyl accident. Okay, acute radiation syndrome. This falls under deterministic effects because it happens immediately, large exposure to radiation. We're going to get into greater depth this a couple of chapters down, but deterministic effects includes the three categories of acute radiation syndrome. Okay, acute means immediate. Okay, immediate or new. So the results of the effects are almost immediate. You have three categories. You have hematologic syndrome, GI syndrome, and the CNS syndrome. And we're talking about very, very high doses of radiation. Generally speaking, what happens is, because it affects many of your blood-forming organs, you get nausea, you get diarrhea, you get pain, you get swelling of the brain, and eventually what the individual dies of is dehydration from the vomiting and the diarrhea. Okay? And if you also think about this, what is the main media for red blood cells?
Water?
Water. So if you're dehydrated, your blood is not going to flow. And what is the whole purpose of your circulation system?
Oxygen,
Carry
nutrients.
oxygen and nutrients to your vital tissues and organs. Okay, so that is the end result. And this happens very quickly, within days. Okay? Also under deterministic effects, you have local tissue skin damage, damage to the gonads, damage to the extremities. Okay? And then hematologic depression, blood-forming organs. And then also cytogenic damage. These are all examples of deterministic effects. Again, we're talking about immediate response. Stochastic effects, on the other hand, we may not see it until later on. So again, this may happen weeks or months or years down the line. This includes leukemia, malignant diseases such as bone, lung, thyroid, and breast cancer. Now, how do we know that? We know this because of those accidents that happened, or where there was a large population that was exposed to great amounts of radiation. This is how we know this. Local skin damage to the skin, gonads, and eyes. We know also that radiation does cause lifespan shortening. By how much? Actually, yes, just a few days. Yeah, so live it up. It's really not a big deal, but they did do studies between different physicians, and they did find out that radiologists had a shorter lifespan than they did other types of physicians, based on exposure to radiation. Okay, genetic damage. You guys remember the genetic effect? We talked about it in 142 and 146. Genetic effect, we are talking about what happens to who?
Future offspring.
Future offsprings. So we won't see the effects until they start to become more apparent in your future offsprings. Okay, and then we have cellular damage. Doubling dose refers to that dose of radiation expected to double the number of genetic mutations in a generation. And the GSD, or the genetically significant dose, which estimates that of offspring that will exhibit a particular response based on a certain dose. That's your GSD. So some of this stuff should be reviewed. You guys covered this in 142, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, the effects of fetal radiation. The effects can either be before birth or after birth. It has been known that radiation can cause prenatal death, or also neonatal death right after they were born. Okay. But you will have arguments that will say that radiation alone isn't the cause of death. It's usually caused by something else. This was just, it promoted the death, but usually a major cause of something else. We know that it can cause congenital malformations in childhood malignancies. Again, this is due to the radiation exposure to a large population and those giving birth who are exposed to large amounts of radiation. Okay? And also diminished growth and development is also the causes the effects of fetal radiation. How are we doing? Good. Okay. So again, everything that we covered in the last few slides was a result of observed radiation effects due to some of these events. And I actually took a photo from the book, and you can look through this. But some of the ones that we've talked about in class includes the early radiologists. If you recall the history of Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen and his discovery of X-rays, it went to immediate use, both medically and novelty-wise, within days and weeks, without proper testing and research. So you had the scientists, you had the researchers, and you also had the early radiologists not understanding the effects of radiation. Most of them died of leukemia. You guys remember Clarence Daly? Okay, he was the assistant to Thomas Edison, and he did a lot of study with Thomas Edison in the development of the fluoroscopic unit. Did you guys know that? Mm-hmm. Thomas Edison had a huge hand on fluoroscopy. And so you had Clarence Daly, who was constantly putting his hand under an X-ray unit, and eventually he had radiation poisoning, lost his fingers, eventually lost his hand, lost his arm, and eventually lost both his upper extremities. So he died a very horrible death. And we also know about the atomic bomb survivors. The atomic bomb survivors. You have those that survived. The study that they did with the atomic bomb survivors, it was based on the location of where they were when the bomb hit. Of course, if you're right around the vicinity of where the bomb exploded, you died immediately, right? And those that were around the vicinity took a little bit longer to die. And as you expanded the area in which the bomb struck, there was either a little effect or no effect. But those who survived, it may not have affected them personally, but it showed later on that their children were suffering from different types of malignant diseases as well. And then the radium watch dial painters. You guys know the history on that? Okay, World War I. World War I. So there was an effort to get everybody involved, pro-American, okay? Everybody had to do their part. So you had soldiers enlisting in the military armed forces. And then you had the women who also want to contribute in their contribution to, do their part for America. Tanks, airplanes. Very hard to see the dials in a dark environment. So they use, ready for this? They use radium, okay? The paint that they used had radium in it. The effects of radium in a dark situation fluoresced. Okay, so it glowed in the dark. So they were using radium to paint these dials, okay, on the warships, on the planes, in the tanks. But if you ever look at a dial, the lines are very fine and the numbers are very fine. So what the painters would do is they would lick the tips of the paintbrush, so with this fine tip, dip it in paint, and then lick the tip again. Okay? So they eventually, they ingested this radium, went into their bloodstream, and eventually caused bone cancer. It was also known that some of these painters would take the paint home, paint their lips and paint their eyebrows, so whenever they went out at night, they would, kind of like club kids. That's what they were doing back in the day. So that's what happened with the radium watch dial painters. Okay, and then radiation in utero, childhood malignancies, radiation during pregnancy. This also was apparent. Now, these findings are based on large exposure of radiation to a significant population size. Some also observed in laboratory animals as well. Okay, but there's a lot more here. If you look at the list, it's a long list of how we were able to determine this. You had the radiologists, atomic bomb, Chernobyl, Marshall Islands, the uranium miners. Okay, you guys remember the uranium miners? They would mine for uranium, and in its unstable state, uranium turns also into radium, which they can breathe, and so the miners got lung cancer. Okay, but you can read through that. It's all pretty interesting. Okay, so radiobiology then. Radiobiology is the study of the effects of ionizing radiation on biological tissues. So that's what we're going to be talking about here in just a moment. But first, let's talk about the cell theory. The cell theory says that all plants and animals are constructed on a basic functional unit known as cells. Right? So you have, and I kind of laid out a diagram here that the basic component are your atoms. Okay, atoms of similar function forms a molecule. Molecules of similar function then forms cells, which are the basic building blocks of all living things. These are the main molecules in human anatomy. As we said earlier, we are composed of 80% water. Then we have proteins, 15%, and then we have lipids, 2%. I think that's a lie. 2% lipids. 1% carbs, 1% nucleic acid, and 1% other. I also put, if they were macromolecules, we're talking about large forming molecules, and if they were organic in nature, by them. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the different molecules in the human body. Okay, water is going to be the most abundant and simplest form of molecule. It is 80%. It exists in a free state, but it's also responsible as a bonding agent for other molecules. Water provides shape, form, and maintains body temperature. What we're talking about here is homeostasis. And we're talking about homeostasis. One great example of maintaining body temperature is what happens when we work out. You sweat and you perspire. The whole thing about that is trying to maintain body temperature by the loss of water. Okay? It's also important in respiration. So it provides shape, form, maintains body temperature, and assists in various biochemical reactions. Water, as well as carbon dioxide, is the end product of catabolism. And the definition of catabolism is changing a complex structure to a more simple structure. And the end result then is a release of energy. The release of energy. This is catabolism. So from a larger complex structure to a simple structure with release of energy. The end result is water and also carbon dioxide. So we got one definition here. Catabolism is breaking down molecules into smaller substances. But we also have what's known as anabolism. This is the producing of larger molecules from smaller ones, just like anabolic steroids. Are we all familiar? Do we know what anabolic steroids do? What do they build?
Muscle.
It builds muscle, okay? All right, let's talk about proteins. Proteins are organic macromolecules. They are long-chain, connected by peptide bonds. The sequence of these amino acids, the macromolecules, determines the function of that particular protein molecule. Proteins provide structure and support, such as muscle, but they also serve other functions, such as enzymes that assist in biochemical reactions, hormones that regulate control over body functions, and antibodies that fight against infection and disease. So again, just to sum it up, basically amino acids are the building blocks of protein. You need a series of 22 amino acids. 22 amino acids are necessary for protein synthesis. 22 amino acids are necessary for protein synthesis. So in other words, you need 22 amino acids to build protein. Okay? Any questions? Okay, lipids. What did we say lipids was? 2%? Okay. Lipids are macromolecules composed of both carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They also have smaller lipids known as glycerol and fatty acids. So lipids are macromolecules, but you have micromolecules known as glycerol or fatty acids. These two will combine to form a lipid. Okay? The glycerol and fatty acid will form a lipid. Lipids are a structural component of cell membranes, and they act as a thermal insulator under the skin. They are present in all tissues. Lipids are present in all tissues. Okay, so not only do they act as an insulator, but we also know that lipids stores energy. They store energy. So they can serve as a fuel in an emergency situation. They can serve as fuel when needed. But is fat easy to break down? It is not. So it's a little bit tougher to convert lipids into energy. It's a little bit more difficult to convert lipids into energy. Now here's something that's interesting. You have your carbohydrates, which are composed of the same thing as lipids. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They're composed of the same thing. But their binding, the way the molecules are bounded together, is much more different. Much more different. So carbohydrates is a carbon structure that is considered watered down. It's a watered down version of lipids. Okay? Thus the name carbohydrates, water. There are several types of carbohydrates. First one is saccharides. Saccharides? Okay. They are small, simple sugars. This includes your monosaccharides and your disaccharides. Then you have your polysaccharides, which are larger, which includes your starches. Where do starches come from? Plants. And then you have glycogen that comes from animal. Okay, so starches come from plants. Glycogen comes from animals. So ultimately, they provide fuel or glucose for cell metabolism. They provide fuel or glucose for cell metabolism. This is the main function of carbohydrates. We call them carbs. Now, as we said earlier, lipids could be catabolized to glucose, into glucose for energy, but it's a lot tougher to do that. Unlike your polysaccharides, they're easier to transform into glucose for energy. And that's why chocolate bars, which is high in glucose, can give you that quick burst of energy.